My name is Michael Spicher. I'm a philosopher and writer based in Boston, and I'll be moderating this discussion. That's a great video. I was lucky to see an early version, see it earlier than a few months ago, I guess, in conversation with Martina. So thank you, Martina, for making that. I know you're in the audience and can't respond back, but anyway. We will begin with about, say, 30 minutes of discussion, then we'll open it up to questions. So please feel free. I see that there's already one person that did this, put a question in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll get to it as best we can in the remaining 10 to 15 minutes. But with that, let me begin by first asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves by, tell us a little bit about yourselves and your work, and the topic of today, how beauty became an important factor to guide your practice and your thoughts and your research. We can start with Don, since you were in the already had pre-recorded words in the video.
All right, thank you. Gosh, what an honor to be here today with all of you. So I'm Don Ruggles. I'm a practicing architect based in Denver, Colorado. I've been in business for over 50 years and literally built thousands of projects. And I started to notice early in my career that there seemed to be distinctly different reactions our clients were having to our projects. Some were described as beautiful, and others were described as unique and interesting and exciting, and they seemed to be diametrically opposed reactions. And that observation occurred early in my career, and I kind of sat on it for a long time and just continued to run an office. And then I discovered the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture in preparing for fundraising event here in Denver. And I started reading some papers and information that was coming out of the neuroscience community. And I realized this is quite impactful, and that in fact it could answer this question that had been nagging me for so long, is why would some projects create a beauty response, and what was a beauty response? And why would other projects create an exciting and unique response? And that was back in 2009, and I've really dedicated my career to advancing these ideas. And I wrote a book, and then also produced a feature-length documentary movie, which is available to rent on Amazon. So 50 years of exploration, and I'm hoping someday to figure it all out. So there you go.
Thanks, Don. Oshin or Alessandro, whoever wants to jump in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I'm an architect as a background, and I practicing architect as Don. And I came to the study of beauty through materials. I mainly work in interior architecture, and the quality of materials and surfaces is so important to define the beauty of a space. And the starting of this research, later on, this became a research activity. And also because I teach at university, so I had the chance to study more in depth this subject. And all began some years ago from a question. I realized that most of people appreciate natural materials. And so, well, actually, almost everybody. I never met someone who disliked wood or natural stone or marble. And so I wonder, can we consider these kind of surfaces a universal canon of beauty? I've already seen that there is a question in the chat asking, do we have universal kind of beauty. Well, probably surfaces are not so important, but I think that in a way, this could be considered something that we all share. So the next step is to try to understand why does it happen. So this became the field of research that I've been working on in the last 10 years.
Great, thank you. And Oshin.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be a part of this panel. I think it's going to be a really great discussion. So my background is in experimental psychology. So and my area of training primarily is in brain imaging. And I became really interested in the topic of beauty because I have a really big interest in empirical aesthetics. So how do people have aesthetic experiences? And if that's the question that you're interested in, then of course the theme of beauty is really central. So there have been lots of really nice studies to show that when you prompt people with the term aesthetics and you ask them what it is that comes to mind almost immediately, beauty comes up right away. I think in about 90% of cases, people think of beauty when they think about aesthetics. And I think the next term that comes up is ugly. So this particular dimension is really central if you're trying to understand aesthetic phenomena. The other reason why I'm really interested in beauty is that I have a really keen interest in understanding the neurobiology of aesthetic experiences. So what happens in the brain when a person looks at an object and categorizes that as beautiful? And a lot of the work in that particular area has really kind of led me to try and understand the role of emotion and affect. So trying to understand the role of reward systems and emotion systems in the brain and the way in which they contribute to our experience of things as beautiful. So that's a little brief description of my interest.
Thank you. I think to start it off, you know, as I said, I'm a philosopher and I teach, and sometimes when I teach things on the nature of beauty, and we read a bunch of different readings on beauty, and then at the end of it, my students are like, "Wait, but we still don't know what it is." So I wonder if you know, even though we can't fully define beauty in a completely precise way or formulaic way, we still know that it's important. But I'm wondering if you could address why is it so important for human flourishing, and why is it so valuable for human beings to experience beauty? And I know that at the beginning of the video, Anjan Chatterjee is quoted as saying, like, imagine a world without it. Yeah, of course. But it seems like there maybe is more to it than just that. That's a great starting point, though, and it's one I've used over and over again. But what else is there? Yeah,
Michael, I've been looking into the notion of homeostasis for several years, which is balance in our nervous system. And our lives are so stressful. We have an incredible amount of information coming at us every second. Our nervous system is completely stressed out trying to process all this information. Beauty is actually the counterbalance to that, because it's a rest and relaxation and pleasure response. And those two things work together to create a healthy nervous system, and that balance is known as homeostasis. Oshin, perhaps you can speak more, medically to this, but this idea in architecture and design that we should create, ideas and designs that have some excitement and uniqueness and some stress to it, and then also components of rest and relaxation and pleasure. Those two things really need to be present to fuel a healthy, balanced nervous system. And I think intuitively, physiologically, we seek that. We seek balance. We seek a sense of well-being. And when we're out of balance, then we take steps to achieve it. So, again, perhaps Oshin, you can speak to that as well.
Well, I can add a bit more to that. But you know, one term that has come up over and over again, and of course in the video, and of course what you just talked about, is this idea of pleasure. And this is a really core issue because we now have a lot of data, both from the psychology and neuroscience of aesthetic experiences, that have shown that the experience of pleasure is a prerequisite for experiencing beauty. So you can think about, for example, other kinds of judgments that we can make. For example, how much do we like something? How much do we prefer something? You can make all of those judgments without necessarily experiencing pleasure, but that is not the case for beauty. And of course, that makes it from an evolutionary perspective very interesting. And another part that comes into play, and this was discussed so very nicely in a paper that was published a couple of years ago by Martin Skov and Marcos Nadal, is this idea that, well, great, pleasure is a prerequisite, but that we also kind of have a mental representation, some kind of a template in our minds that represents what beauty is for us on an individual basis. So what typically will happen when people make some kind of a beauty judgment is that you have an experience of pleasure, and then you do a template matching between features of the object that you're looking at and your own mental representation of what a beautiful object is. And I think if there's a match there, then you make that judgment. So it's kind of like a two-step process, which is why that second part requires a bit of effort. Unlike, for example, judgments of things like, you know, liking and preference can be sort of done almost effortlessly. For beauty, you need a bit of cognitive input to make that match.
Well, if I can add something, I perfectly agree with Dawn's description about homeostasis, and I would add something. Well, I also came to study, to try to study, to understand the role of neurosciences in determining what happens physiologically when we perceive beauty. But before arriving to that step, I wanted to find a way, let's say evidence-based, as I said in the beginning about materials, to define which are the materials that people like. And so I started from data coming from the business of this material. So I got in touch with associations and companies, and they, especially those companies producing imitative materials. Imitative materials are a big trend in the market. And it seems that people tend to prefer these materials. So these companies, all of them, ceramic, laminates, PVC, they can reproduce the effect of natural material in a very precise way. So people prefer to buy this material. All these processes are based on digital reproduction. So actually we could have surfaces reproducing any kind of image, but people prefer natural, the look of natural material. So this was the first evidence-based data. The following is to try to understand if we can describe this preference with science, with experiments. So the next step was to get in touch with some professors in neuroscience in university, Bicocca University in Milan. I teach in Politecnico, so I'm on the design side. And I started to work with scientists, so they could explain much better than me the most medical part. But together we defined a possible program of research. And this program is based on, let's say, a double-blind method. So we would show people imitative materials and real natural materials, and then without telling them which is which. And only at the end, we can explain what they have seen, and we record the reaction that they can have. So with EEG, and this can be a method to understand if there is a match or a mismatch between what they read and what they know. This is because there is also a very important cultural element in defining what is beauty. So on one side, we have something that seems to be natural for everybody, the appreciation of natural materials. And on the other side, we have to understand which is the cultural role. Just another small detail that we can add to the discussion. Imitative materials are a booming market, but not for experts. Architects, they don't like imitative material because they have a different cultural background and they generally prefer real natural material. So they see beauty only in that, and they tend not to accept imitative material as beautiful because they are fake. And this is a kind of the explanation for this may come from a different culture.
Makes you think they're influenced by Plato, who didn't like imitation. Anyway, so if beauty is so important and valuable for human well-being and flourishing, why is beauty so often neglected or treated as an afterthought? And I think of French philosopher Albert Camus, who wrote, man cannot do without beauty, and this is what our era pretends to want to disregard. So why is it so neglected? And maybe to combine two questions I have into one. I know one limitation is sometimes the research that people do in universities is behind two different kinds of walls. One is a paywall and one is a wall of jargon. So maybe part of that could be, how can we get that information to people? But why, anyway, so first question, why is it neglected? Second, how can we help alleviate that neglect?
Well, there's been such a strong emphasis since World War I, frankly, on different notions of what's important to the human condition in art and architecture. And it was much more functional, and then also creating a response, an exciting or unique response. I seem to be landing on those words over and over today. But it really started to come out of the Bauhaus, the German school that was tasked with creating architects and designers to help rebuild Europe after the two world wars. And the functionalism became the most important driving concept. And the idea that beauty was pushed aside because frankly, it was deemed irrelevant. And I think science now is starting to understand, in fact, it's not irrelevant. It's very, very important to the human condition, to our health and well-being. And I am involved in upper education here for architects, and primarily the emphasis in education has been on teaching the Bauhaus method of asymmetry, spare design. And so our built environment, for the most part, in the 20th century came out of those notions. And that's what we're living with, and much to our detriment, honestly. And I just think what this group is trying to do is redirect the discussion so that this notion of pleasure and beauty can be included in the equation. I think if we go down the AI road and start creating architecture through computerization, beauty has to be part of the algorithm that they use to create our built environment going forward. So, but I lay the response really on the education system. And we have young people coming into our office. These are high school students that have studied architecture, some in prep schools, and they want to know about beauty, and they're in pursuit of it. And, you know, I try to say, well, listen, when you go to university, they're going to try to strip all that away. And you hold on to it. It's just, you know, such an important aspect, can be in their careers.
I dared my students once to tell their studio professors that their only goal is to create beauty, just to see what they would say. I don't think any of them took me up on it, but they all laughed immediately, knowing that the kind of reactions they would receive. If anyone else has anything to add to the why is it neglected issue.
Oh, I work mainly in interior architecture, and the influence of Bauhaus and modernism has been forgotten for a long time. And instead, there are trends and languages, and they've been the main way of developing the design for many years. But now I see that there is a good hope not to neglect beauty, because we are changing also at university the way we teach by giving more importance to the sensorial aspect. So if we start from what the senses perceive and try to study and go in deep and find also some methods to try to measure. Of course, it's not totally rational. On the contrary, it should be also very emotional. But if we find a way to measure the good feelings that we have, for example, when we perceive a space based on senses, maybe we can find a good way to know more about beauty.
Yeah, I actually have something to add that's sort of very similar, along similar lines, which kind of has to do with this basic issue that we have in psychology laboratories in terms of conceptual and operational definitions. So pretty much anything that we study, we try to somehow come up with some kind of a good conceptual definition for, and then we have to find some way to actually measure it. And I want to go back to this term that Anjan Chatterjee used in a video when he was talking about beauty, which is the sense of mystery. And I think a lot of people have sort of shied away from studying beauty because they found it difficult to define and measure. But I think it's a bit unfortunate, because what you can do, which is what you can do with all of these other complicated higher order constructs, is that you can break them down into components that you can study. So in our studies of neuroscience of architecture, we always ask about beauty, not so much trying to understand what beauty is as a overarching construct itself, but what some of its constituent components are. For example, you can ask yourself, does affect play a role? Or for example, does effort come into play? And then once you try to simplify the question into things that you can really measure, then I think it becomes more of a tractable problem. So, you know, everything in small measures.
Yeah, I like that, because like people often don't think about how much distraction plays a role in our dislikes of things. Like it's on the opposite side. Like if you're in an art gallery and there's people talking loudly, like beyond a normal respectable volume, or you know, kids running around or something, it may distract you enough to where you can't focus enough to appreciate what, and then so you might leave thinking I didn't enjoy that. And so there's a lot of factors. I like the idea of breaking it down to smaller things and its constituent parts. I guess I might sort of move to some of the questions that people have asked here. I think one that's kind of important is there a universal beauty? My students are usually amazed when I tell them that the notion of beauty being in the eye of the beholder is relatively recent in human history. Like most of the prominent philosophers had some sort of objective basis, even if it was still somewhat mysterious. But is there a universal beauty? And I think related to that, this same person wrote, is there an inbuilt or genetic sense of beauty? And you know, using examples of biophilia and you know, pre-programmed attraction to nature. So yeah, is there a universal aspect? Open anyone.
so maybe I'll jump in just so others can disagree with it. A quick thing that we know from kind of larger body of work in neuroscience is this idea called the common currency hypothesis. So it's this idea that we've got this very consistent set of regions in the brain that compute reward value that come online when we're experiencing pleasure across a whole bunch of different domains. So, you know, how much we like chocolate, sexual pleasure, looking at beautiful faces, looking at artwork and architecture that's moving. They tend to activate a very common set of regions, okay? So in that sense, there's some commonality in the brain in terms of the neurobiological underpinning of reward that's then fed up to inform feelings of beauty. But that's not the complete picture. There's clearly all kinds of social factors, contextual factors, individual differences factors that are interacting with that to generate a beauty response. So, the question as to whether there's something universal is difficult to answer in one fell swoop. So I think that there are some common components to it, and of course we also see lots of individual differences.
One of the things our firm has been looking at quite closely for a number of years is the utilization of the 3x3 pattern in the composition of art and architecture. And we traced it back, we believe, to the bonding that happens between child and caregiver in the first months and years of life, because it's the child is actually learning to see the 3x3 pattern, the facial pattern, and then learning what empathy is. And then when you see that pattern later on in the facade of a building composition, then it generates the same empathic reward process that happened during the bonding, which is a sense of pleasure. The child is being nurtured, fed, and cared for. And that's all positive, you know, nurturing, feel-good responses. So we think, because we exalt and honor all these different buildings around the world, in every continent, that made of the 3x3 pattern, that there's something pretty strong here between the recognition of the facial pattern and the generation of a pleasure response. And my general response when I've asked, well, what is beauty? I'll reply that it's a physical response to the recognition. Your brain is recognizing patterns that are pleasurable. And some of them are learned, but I think some of them are inherited. And anyway, the really strongest one in terms of art and architecture seems to be the 3x3 pattern. But certainly what Alessandro is looking into, the natural qualities of surfaces, is, my goodness, I mean, we've been living with this since our evolution. This is just common to our evolutionary history. This is millions of years before there were ever any synthetic materials, of course. So, you know, that's part of our DNA. I think we're inheriting this preference for natural materials because I think it tells us, you know, we're safe when we touch it. We know what it is. We don't have to spend a lot of time trying to process it. It's an immediate, fast response.
Yes, I perfectly agree. Probably there is a primitive attitude towards these materials because they were the first things that we used as tools. And let's think about wood. Everybody say wood is warm. But if we try to, well, before when I was talking about measurements, I was thinking about qualitative, not quantitative measurements. So in a scale to understand what goes in the direction of beauty. And thinking about the warmth of wood, for example, it may come from the fact that we can use it for fire. Fire was discovered, let's say discovered, around from 20 to 30,000 years ago. In the beginning, it was occasional, given in the nature by fires, and all people started to use it only later on. And when we say that wood is warm, probably it's warm because when we touch it, it's warm. We can use it for the fire, and also we can use it in a space as a insulating material to keep the space warm. So this may be one of the reasons why we all agree, as we were saying, on the appreciation of this material. And something more could be about epigenetic. So, as you were saying, in the DNA, probably we wonder, and this is a field of research that is open because everything is still to do, is yet to be done, to understand if in the ages, in 1,000 years, somehow there is something in our brain that reacts to this stimuli. For example, yes, we don't have instinct like birds that build a nest, but does it happen, we wonder, I don't have the answer, that when we touch and see and get close to wood, for example, something happens in our body, in our brain. We don't know that, but maybe we can open this kind of research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so one indirect way to touch on what Alessandro talked about, which I think is very interesting, is the people's preference patterns and how they vary with respect to natural versus human-made artifacts. So there's a very nice study that was published a few years ago by Ed Vessel in Cognition, where he looked at how much people vary in what they like when you show them stimuli from different categories. So he showed that when people are looking at stimuli that are sourced from the natural world, so these are, for example, scenes from nature or faces, there tends to be a lot of agreement in what people like. So there must be some kind of a signal along the lines that Alessandro mentioned that people are responding to that is sort of evolutionarily conserved, and we're exhibiting that when we're rating things. Whereas when you switch to things like architecture and artwork, there's a lot of variation, because there, of course, you'd expect to see a lot more social cultural factors that come into play that are probably less preserved evolutionarily. So this I find to be very interesting. You can sort of, prompt people for judgments, and that will kind of give you like an indirect sense of whether you're looking at something that's more versus less conserved through evolution.
Yeah, I kind of similar to what you were just saying. The notion of familiarity seems to play a role as well, and so people around the world most of us have seen a sunset at some point, and which is why we have more universal agreement there. And a lot of the differences with art and architecture arise because, take one of the oldest conditions of beauty that go back all the way to Plato and Aristotle, proportion. If I say make a building or make a painting that has proportion, there's almost an infinite number of ways you could fulfill that request, and that's sort of how some of the differences develop in different cultures. They sort of gravitate one way, and not another way. I wanted to ask a question. If aesthetics is crucial to human well-being, as seems to be what everyone's agreeing on, whatever that means, do architects and designers have some kind of ethical obligation to attempt? I mean, we could all admit that there could be failures, but to at least be motivated to make buildings that have some kind of aesthetic component. And I'm thinking of one of the most visceral experiences I've personally had was I went to a city when I was much younger to assist with a group that was handing out clothing to people living on the streets, and they had a program for children and different things. And at one point we walked through these projects, and this particular one, were terrible. like just walking there, not even living there, you felt oppressed. And I've never had that experience so viscerally in a human-made structure as I did that moment. It was dark. It was and do we have some kind of ethical responsibility or duty to add beauty or aesthetics into our designs and architecture? I know it's a very loaded question, because I know the big question, of course, is going to be, well, how to actually implement it. We can table that, but just theoretically, I mean, maybe even anyway. So
I'll tackle that. And it's something I've been talking about for a while. If, as architects, we know that our design is going to create a stress response, or we have the opportunity to create a rest and relaxation response, and we purposely create the stress response, which is not good for our health in the long term. It can be in short bursts, but long-term stress is not good for us. So if we know we are categorically creating a stress response, then I think we've been negligent, and that has medical implications. This is, a pretty profound, I think, observation. There's a quote that's used in one of the seminars that I'm part of, and that goes that architects and designers have a greater responsibility, or a bigger responsibility, to affect public health than medical professionals in our current scientific environment. And this is absolutely stunning. I think what the designs that we're creating are actually creating a stress response, and that's not good for us. So if we have the opportunity and the knowledge to create a rest and relaxation response instead of a stress response, I think we're duty bound to pursue that. And of course, beauty is a rest and relaxation response. So it's quite a big responsibility, I think, that we find ourselves having to take on now as architects. I think it's coming. I don't think, think of it as secondhand smoke. I mean, that was an idea that was laughable back in the 50s. And now it's, part of our jurisprudence. So I think the same thing will be developing. I think the public good is about creating an environment that supports our health and well-being. United Nations just passed a resolution saying that every individual should be ensured a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I mean, this is sea change, new direction for society. So I think architects are going to have to pay attention to that. Alessandro, what do you think?
I could try to answer to the question by going back to the last century. In the last century, well, even before, since the Victorian age, in the world of architecture, there was, in reaction to the Beaux-Arts and to the styles of the past that were using a lot of decoration, modern architects, starting from Adolf Loos, they started to use this expression, honest materials. Honest is a word that implies a kind of ethical value of materials. What are honest materials? Are the materials appropriate to the use without a decoration? That is the same that Bauhaus was promoting. And so I will answer with another question, that is, if honest material, for example, if natural material are honest, but people likes imitative material, can we say that imitative material are not honest? In a way, they are fake. They're not telling the truth. But I take, for example, the hospital of my city. They decided to use this very high quality ceramic with a wood effect on all the floor. And if you enter, you don't think, oh, that's fake, that's not honest, but it's giving pleasure to the people. So I think that the question is still open between a biological response and a cultural one. Yeah, so I try to answer, but at the same time, I open a new doubt.
Wait, I thought only philosophers were supposed to answer questions with questions.
This is like a philosopher recruitment program.
Similar to that question, we're basically out of time. So I figured one way to maybe, I know there's way too many good comments and questions. That could be the comments and questions here in the Q&A could be a whole other hour of discussion, of good discussion. But to be true to time and everything, I wanted to just end similar to what we have. I think this is kind of an important question. The question is, do you have any tips to defend beauty in regular architectural practice with an average budget and average ambition when clients don't have well-being or beauty as an agenda and look mostly, I'm not sure I understand, but look mostly at just the functionality, I guess, of the space, I'll say. I'll actually say one quick answer to that. One of my colleagues and friends, Suchi Reddy, who's an architect based in New York, she said that when everything went down in 2020 and everyone was sort of trapped in their homes all of a sudden, she had several clients tell her, basically contact her and thank her for pushing them toward a particular design, because now that they're trapped in this space, they see how much better it is than it would have been otherwise. So I do know that has happened in that. But anyway, what tips would you have to defend this? Because sometimes when people are saying, "What's the bottom line? Beauty is frivolous," I've heard those kinds of conversations in context of urban planning, product design, and I'm sure you all have heard that as well. So what tips would you have for defending it? And let's try and make it somewhat quickly because we're sort of out of time.
Well, I just asked the question: is it a pleasure, or is it pleasurable? Beauty is such a word fraught with so many meanings culturally. Just say, is what I'm looking at and what I'm experiencing, does it feel good? Is it pleasurable? I think that's a really, really good start. And I think that's exactly what Alessandro and Oshin are talking about here, is what do we have to get to create a pleasure response in an environment?
Mm-hmm. And from a completely practical perspective, we sort of now have a library of geometric features about which we're learning more and more from psychology and neuroscience that are actually quite easy to implement. This was probably a little bit harder to do maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but there's now really an emergence of an evidence base. And some of them are more difficult to implement compared to others, but I think there are some that are very easy to do, ranging from, things like contour and ceiling height and perceived enclosure, color, surface, texture, about which one can find a lot of empirical evidence. And I think there's now a real opportunity to see whether, based on the needs that you're really after, whether you can implement some of those easy solutions.
Well, maybe the answer, I don't know how to answer in the current situation, but I think that what we can do is to try to improve sensitiveness. And as a teacher, I think that what we can do is for the future to try to transmit this attention to the students and to the future generations. Actually, I think that we are already going in this direction. So I think that we can try to push it, and so the future will improve.
Well, thank you to Oshin, Don, and Alessandro. Thanks to Martina and team for organizing this. And thank you for everyone for attending. I'm apologize we didn't get to so many of your good questions and comments. The only thing I could say is I'm sure all 4 of us are emailable, and you can invite any one of us to come speak to you and your team, or all of us. Maybe we can all finally meet in person. But anyway, with that, thank you to everyone, and I guess that's it. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much. Goodbye.